Agent Maya Wilson stepped out of the black SUV and into the humid air of the small town she had been assigned to. The streets were quiet, almost unnervingly so, as if they held a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder and surveyed the surroundings. A sleepy town on the surface, but Maya knew better. Behind every corner, there were whispers of something darker, something the local authorities hadn't yet fully uncovered. She had been sent here by the FBI to help investigate a rising crime syndicate operating under the radar. Maya's reputation as a relentless agent had earned her this mission, but she also knew it had earned her skepticism from some of the locals. She wasn't here to make friends, she was here to get results. Her first stop was the local precinct where she would meet Officer Daniel Hayes. He was the type of cop who had made a name for himself through old-school methods, which meant he didn't like being told what to do by outsiders, especially when those outsiders were federal agents, and even more so when they were black women. Maya had been briefed on Hayes' reputation, a stubborn, prideful man who valued tradition over innovation and who would likely see her arrival as an intrusion rather than an asset. She could already feel the weight of his disdain even before they met. Inside the precinct, the tension was thick like smoke in a room that hadn't aired out in years. The officers looked at her as if she were an alien, though none dared speak it aloud. Maya stood tall with a controlled calm as she walked toward the desk where Hayes was sitting, his back turned. As if he hadn't heard her approach, he finally turned when she spoke, introducing herself without hesitation or apology. The moment their eyes met, she saw something in his gaze, a mix of suspicion and curiosity, but mostly defensiveness. He wasn't used to being challenged, and certainly not by someone like her. Maya had extended her hand. Confidently, she had dealt with officers like Hayes before, those who had not yet adjusted to the evolving face of law enforcement, those who thought power was something you earned through force and toughness rather than through skill and intelligence. Hayes stared at her hand for a brief moment before shaking it. His grip was firm, but there was something about it that wasn't entirely welcoming. They exchanged pleasantries, and then the conversation turned to business. Maya outlined the scope of the investigation and the key suspects she had identified in the syndicate. Hayes listened half-heartedly, leaning back in his chair with a skeptical look that Maya knew all too well, the look of someone who believed they knew better and resented being told they didn't. She couldn't blame him, though she understood the frustration of having someone from the outside walk in and tell you how to do your job. The problem was he had no idea how far she was willing to go to crack this case and how much more he was going to learn from her than he would ever expect. As the briefing continued, Hayes interrupted her a few times, dismissing her points with an air of superiority. He had already decided in his mind that he knew how to handle things better. Maya didn't flinch. She simply answered his questions with the facts, no embellishment, no anger, just the truth. That was her approach always. The meeting ended with a terse agreement to move forward with the investigation despite their differences, but Maya knew deep down this was only the beginning. The real challenge had yet to come. She was here to make an impact and to show them all exactly what she was made of. The next few days were filled with long hours spent combing through data, tracking leads, and analyzing patterns. Maya's sharp mind quickly pieced together information that the local police hadn't even considered. She discovered connections between seemingly unrelated events and suspects, and with every breakthrough, her confidence grew. But as much as she excelled in her work, her relationship with Officer Daniel Hayes only worsened. Hayes didn't hide his disdain for Maya's methods. He criticized her use of technology, her reliance on data, and her seemingly aloof demeanor. To him, everything she did seemed impersonal, too analytical, not enough hands-on. But Maya could feel the underlying tension growing between them. It was more than just professional rivalry. It was personal, and it was rooted in something deeper, something unspoken. One afternoon, the team received a tip that a key member of the syndicate would be at a local bar for a meeting. It was a risky lead, but it was one that could provide the evidence they needed to move forward. Maya immediately took charge, drafting a plan that would ensure minimal risk to the officers while still catching the criminals red-handed. But when the team gathered to discuss the operation, Hayes interrupted her. This isn't a boardroom, Wilson, Hayes said, his tone cold. We don't need all your fancy surveillance tech and tactics. Just give me a few good men, and we'll handle this ourselves. Maya fought the urge to roll her eyes. She had seen this kind of thing before. A stubborn cop who thought he knew better than everyone else. But she couldn't afford to get distracted by his ego. The case was too important. Instead, Maya calmly responded, I'm not suggesting we don't use traditional methods, Hayes. I'm suggesting we combine them. We can't afford to take unnecessary risks. We need to be strategic. For a moment, the room fell silent. Hayes' gaze hardened, and it was clear he wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like her. What makes you think you know what's best? Hayes sneered. You're not from here, Wilson. You don't understand how we do things. You think you can just come in and take over. His words stung, but Maya didn't let it show. She had been through far worse. Too many times, in fact. She had faced worse than mere prejudice. She had faced systemic obstacles. But she had always fought back, always found a way to succeed. She wasn't about to let a small-town cop derail her mission. Actually, Hayes, Maya replied, her voice steady, I'm not trying to take over. I'm trying to do what's best for the case, and for everyone involved. This isn't about me. It's about getting results. For a moment, it seemed like the tension would escalate. The officers in the room exchanged nervous glances, unsure if this was going to turn into a shouting match. But Hayes, despite his resistance, seemed to pause. He looked at Maya, really looked at her for the first time since their meeting. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps a begrudging respect, or maybe the faintest hint of doubt about his own approach. Whatever it was fleeting. I'll follow your lead this time, Hayes muttered, his voice low but firm. But don't expect me to like it. Maya nodded, fighting back a smile. Just follow the plan, Hayes, and I promise you'll like the results. The operation was set for the following night. As Maya prepared her team, she couldn't help but wonder how far Hayes would go to prove his worth. And more importantly, whether he was capable of trusting her when it counted. That night, everything would change. They had the element of surprise, the evidence, and most importantly, the resolve to see it through. But it would take all of them, working together, if they wanted to succeed. Maya knew she was ready. What she didn't know was whether Hayes was. The following night, the operation went ahead as planned. The small, dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town became the focal point of their strategy. Maya, Hayes, and a team of local officers were stationed in nearby buildings, prepared to move in at a moment's notice. Maya had set up the surveillance equipment, cameras, microphones, the works, but Hayes insisted on staying in the field with the rest of the officers, a move that felt more like an attempt to assert his authority than anything practical. As the hours passed, Maya could feel the tension in the air. They were close, so close, but there was a lingering unease. Her gut was telling her something wasn't right. The tip had been solid, but her instincts were sharper than any piece of technology. She watched the monitors, her eyes scanning every movement, every shadow. The suspect hadn't arrived yet, but something about the way the people in the bar interacted made her uneasy. It wasn't long before her suspicion proved true. The door swung open and a man walked in, his face partially obscured by a cap and dark glasses. Maya's heart skipped a beat. She zoomed in on his face, confirming what she already feared. This was their guy, one of the key figures in the syndicate. Hayes, he's here, Maya whispered into her radio, her voice calm but urgent. Prepare for the takedown. The plan was simple: move in fast, secure the target, and prevent anyone from escaping. But Maya had learned the hard way that plans rarely survive first contact with reality. As the team moved to execute the operation, everything went sideways. A loud crash echoed from inside the bar. A struggle. Then a shout. The suspect had been tipped off. He bolted for the back exit, but not before taking a few shots of the officers closing in on him. The chaos was immediate. Shouts, gunfire, the sound of shuffling feet as officers scrambled to take cover. Maya's pulse quickened. This was no longer a simple operation. It had turned into a full-blown firefight. Maya, stay back. Hayes' voice crackled through the radio. but it was too late. Maya was already moving, her training kicking in. She wasn't going to sit idly by. She was the lead agent here, and this was her case. She sprinted toward the back of the building, her hand instinctively resting on the holster of her weapon. The chaos inside the bar had spilled into the alleyway, where the suspect had taken cover behind a dumpster. Maya's focus narrowed. There was no room for hesitation now. She couldn't afford to let this man escape, not after everything they'd risked to get to this point. Maya, get back here now. Hayes' voice was frantic now, laced with worry. But Maya ignored him. She wasn't going to wait for permission to do what had to be done. As she rounded the corner, she saw the suspect. He had his back to her, distracted by the officers moving in from the front. This was her chance. She drew her weapon, her aim steady, and just as the man turned, she fired. The shot rang out, loud and sharp in the narrow alley, but it wasn't a kill shot. The bullet struck the ground just inches from his feet, sending him stumbling backward. "Freeze!" Maya shouted, her voice sharp and commanding. The suspect hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Maya didn't give him the chance to decide. She closed the distance, tackling him to the ground before he could react. They struggled briefly, but Maya's strength and training gave her the upper hand. In seconds, she had him cuffed, pinned to the ground, and secured. Breathing heavily, she stood up, her eyes scanning the alley. Her team had arrived, and they moved quickly to arrest the rest of the gang members who had been trying to flee. But as she glanced back at the bar, she saw Hayes emerging, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. For the first time in the entire operation, he wasn't yelling or criticizing her. He was silent, watching her, his expression unreadable. Maya didn't wait for him to speak. She turned back to the suspect, her focus already on what came next. This wasn't over yet. They had more work to do. But as she pulled the cuffs tighter on the suspect's wrists, a small part of her allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. She had done it, not because she was trying to prove something, but because it was the right thing to do. And Hayes, well, for the first time, he was watching her with something that wasn't disdain. There was something else in his eyes now, something that, for all his pride, he couldn't hide. It was respect. The operation was a success. The suspect was in custody, and the team had managed to dismantle the small faction of the syndicate that had been operating out of the town. It wasn't a complete victory. There were still far too many pieces left to the puzzle, too many loose ends that needed to be tied up, but it was a step forward. Back at the precinct, the air was charged with the kind of satisfaction that came with a job well done. Officers were high-fiving each other, sharing drinks, and exchanging stories of how they'd managed to capture the criminals. But as the celebration continued, Maya found herself standing off to the side, lost in thought. She couldn't afford to let herself get distracted, not when the bigger challenge loomed just ahead. She glanced over at Hayes, who was standing near the coffee table, talking to a few of the officers. His posture was more relaxed than she had ever seen, and for a brief moment, Maya couldn't help but notice the subtle change in the way he interacted with her. He wasn't dismissing her ideas. He wasn't undermining her authority. For once, there was a mutual understanding in the room. Hayes caught her eye, and his face softened ever so slightly. He raised his drink to her, a small but genuine gesture of acknowledgement. Maya didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. The respect between them had been earned, and neither of them needed to spell it out. Still, it was a shift. It was progress. Later that evening, the precinct cleared out, and the noise of celebration died down. Maya remained at her desk, poring over the intel she had gathered. She felt a sense of urgency growing inside her. This syndicate wasn't just a small-time operation. They were connected to something much larger, something that spread across state lines and involved powerful figures in law enforcement and politics. If they didn't move fast, they would lose the trail. Hayes, apparently having had enough of the quiet, walked over to her desk. Maya didn't look up immediately, but she could feel his presence. She knew what he was going to say before he even opened his mouth. "You did good out there," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. Maya looked up, meeting his gaze. "I didn't do it alone," she replied, not allowing herself to bask in the compliment. She didn't need praise. She needed results. Hayes grunted, stepping closer. Yeah, I saw that. But you're still not like the others. You don't just wait for orders, do you? Maya shook her head. I don't have time to wait. Not when lives are on the line. A long pause hung in the air. Hayes seemed to be weighing something, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. For a moment, Maya thought he might speak again, but instead he just nodded. You're right, he said finally, his voice quieter now. This thing goes deeper than we thought. I know the local guys think we got a handle on it, but there's something off. The way some of these players have been moving. It's not just petty criminals. It's bigger than that. Maya's heart sank a little. She had been expecting this. The feeling in her gut, the growing unease, it hadn't been wrong. The syndicate was just a small part of a much larger operation, and the people pulling the strings were far more dangerous than they had anticipated. That's what I've been thinking, Maya said, her voice steady. I'll need your help. We can't take them down without full intel, and we can't afford to let them slip through the cracks. There are too many corrupt officers and politicians involved. We need to move carefully. Hayes looked at her, his expression serious. You're not alone on this, Wilson. I've got your back, whatever it takes. For the first time since they had met, Maya believed him. She could see it in his eyes, a willingness to do what was right, even if it meant crossing lines he hadn't been willing to cross before. She didn't know if it was respect or something else, but in that moment, Maya knew she had a partner, even if it had taken this long to get here. As the night wore on, Maya and Hayes began to map out their next steps. They needed to gather more intel, get closer to the people at the top, and take down the syndicate's financial network. It was risky, dangerous even, but it was the only way to truly end the criminal empire once and for all. Outside, the town was still quiet, almost deceptively so. But Maya could feel the storm brewing beneath the surface, and she knew that if she and Hayes were going to stop it, they had to move quickly. We do this together, Maya said, her voice firm. No more playing it safe. No more hesitation. Hayes nodded, his jaw set. Together. And with that, they began planning their next move, the weight of the task ahead hanging over them, but the resolve in their hearts stronger than ever. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and meticulous planning. Maya and Hayes, now united in their shared mission, spent every waking moment strategizing, reviewing evidence, and pulling every string they could find to take down the syndicate. Maya's instinct had proven right. The operation was much bigger than they had initially thought. It stretched far beyond this small town and reached the powerful corridors of politics and law enforcement. They knew they had to act fast. The higher-ups were already beginning to catch wind of their investigation, and time was quickly running out. The people at the top of the syndicate weren't just criminals. They were untouchable figures in the community, figures with the power to ruin anyone who got in their way. Maya's gut told her the first domino was about to fall, and if they didn't move quickly, they would be the ones to fall next. I've got a lead, Maya said one morning, her voice low but urgent as she approached Hayes at his desk. He was poring over a map of the town, connecting dots and routes, trying to figure out where the syndicate's money was flowing. One of our informants, she's close to the top. She says there's a meeting tonight at the old warehouse by the docks. They're finalizing a deal. Hayes looked up from his map, his eyes narrowing. That's it. That's the break we've been waiting for. The warehouse was a place few people dared go, isolated and abandoned for years. It had once been the site of legitimate business, but now it was the perfect hideout for those who wanted to keep their transactions off the radar. They knew if they didn't catch the deal tonight, the syndicate would have moved on by morning, and they'd lose everything they'd worked for. Get the team ready, Maya said, determination clear in her tone. We hit them hard. We don't give them time to run. That evening, Maya and Hayes arrived at the warehouse with a small team of local officers. The streets were eerily quiet, and the dark silhouette of the warehouse loomed in front of them, like a forgotten relic. Maya's hand instinctively moved to her weapon. The air felt thick, charged with anticipation. They were close to the heart of the operation, the people who had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. The plan was simple. They would secure the perimeter, move in quietly, and catch the syndicate in the act. But nothing ever went as planned. Maya's gut was telling her that the night would be far from easy. The moment they stepped onto the grounds, she knew something wasn't right. The usual sounds of the city, distant traffic, the occasional dog barking had all faded. The only sound now was the rustling of the wind through the trees. "We're too exposed out here," Maya said quietly, glancing around. "We need to move in fast." Hayes nodded, motioning for the team to follow her lead. They moved swiftly but cautiously, every step calculated, every sound amplified in the oppressive silence. As they neared the entrance of the warehouse, Maya's heart began to race. This was it, the moment of truth. They breached the door, and what they saw inside stopped them cold. The warehouse wasn't empty as they had expected. Instead, it was filled with armed men, their attention focused on a long wooden table where a stack of cash and briefcases were piled high. Behind the table stood a man Maya recognized instantly. It was Councilman Greg Simmons, a man who had been in power for years, known for his public image as a pillar of the community. But Maya had uncovered his involvement in laundering money for the syndicate. The man was untouchable until now. Hayes' eyes widened in disbelief. "Simmons? Here?" Maya's jaw tightened, but she didn't hesitate. "He's the one pulling the strings. He's the one we've been looking for." Without warning, the sound of a gunshot rang out. One of the officers, caught off guard, was hit in the shoulder. The chaos exploded in an instant. Officers dove for cover as the syndicate members began firing back, and Maya's instincts kicked in. "Move! Move!" she shouted, diving for cover behind a large crate. The officers returned fire, and the sound of gunshots echoed through the warehouse. In the midst of the chaos, Maya caught a glimpse of Simmons. He was making a run for it. She didn't think. She just acted. Maya sprinted toward him, her mind focused solely on one thing: taking him down. She couldn't let him escape. Not now. Not after everything they'd fought for. Simmons turned just as she reached him, pulling a gun from his jacket. But before he could aim, Maya was on him, tackling him to the ground. The two of them tumbled in a flurry of motion, but Maya's grip was unyielding. She managed to pin his arms behind his back and yank his gun from his hand, throwing it across the room. "Get in cuff!" Maya yelled to the other officers, still panting from the struggle. Hayes, though wounded and slightly disoriented from the fight, rushed over to help. As the officers secured Simmons, Maya stood up, wiping the sweat from her brow. It was over, or at least it was for Simmons. The syndicate had taken a massive blow, but Maya knew the fight wasn't over yet. There were still others to catch, still more pieces of the puzzle to unravel. But for now they had won, and that, Maya realized, was enough for tonight. The aftermath of the warehouse bust was chaotic, but undeniably victorious. Maya watched as Simmons was handcuffed and escorted to the waiting police vehicles. His previously confident demeanor had shattered, replaced by a quiet fury as the realization sank in. He was no longer untouchable. Maya took a moment to breathe, her heart still racing from the adrenaline of the takedown. But her mind was already moving forward, processing the next steps. They had him, the man who had been laundering money for the syndicate, the man with ties to corrupt law enforcement and politicians. But that was only one part of the puzzle. Simmons was a major player, but the operation still had a long way to go. "Is everyone okay?" Maya called out, scanning the officers who had been with her. There were a few injuries, nothing too serious, thank God, but nothing that could slow them down. Hayes, despite a graze on his arm, was the first to walk over. "Nice work," he said, his voice still gruff but filled with admiration. Maya nodded curtly. "We're not done yet, Hayes. Simmons is a key piece, but there's more to this than just him. The higher-ups will have someone waiting to take his place. We need to make sure they can't just replace him." Hayes looked down at the ground for a moment, his eyes focused. He seemed to be digesting the weight of her words. "You're right. There's always someone else pulling the strings." Maya was already on her phone, making quick calls to the higher-ups of the FBI and local authorities. The bust had caught them by surprise, but Maya knew they couldn't afford to sit back and wait for paperwork to catch up. The syndicate was still active, and the core leaders were still out there, likely scrambling to secure their operations. As the team worked to secure the scene and gather evidence, Maya found herself standing alone for a moment, her thoughts drifting back to the danger they had just narrowly avoided. Every step of this investigation had felt like walking a tightrope. One wrong move, one missed detail, and they would have lost everything. But they hadn't. They'd won this round, and that victory, though hard-earned, was still a victory. We've got a long road ahead of us, but Simmons won't be talking easily, she muttered to herself, trying to center her thoughts. She knew the real fight was yet to come. Simmons was not the kind of man to cooperate without a fight. If he had any inkling that his life was in danger, he would clam up and let his lawyers handle everything. But Maya had no intention of letting him slip through her fingers. As if on cue, her phone buzzed. She looked down and saw a message from one of her FBI contacts. Asterisk Simmons is already in deep with several prominent figures. If we don't break him now, he'll vanish into the system before we can get a confession asterisk. Maya swore under her breath. She knew the system too well. Powerful people always found ways to escape accountability. If Simmons was given even an inch of space, he'd worm his way out of the charges. But Maya wasn't about to let that happen. Get him to interrogation, she said, marching over at Hayes. We need him talking, and we need it now. No delays, no waiting around for him to lawyer out. Hayes raised an eyebrow, but didn't question her. You're sure about this? Maya met his gaze. The longer we wait, the more time they have to cover their tracks. We need Simmons to crack, and we need it fast. Hayes nodded and made a signal to the officers. The team immediately shifted gears, making arrangements for a rapid transfer to the interrogation room. Maya followed closely behind, her mind already running through the possible strategies to break Simmons down. The walk to the building's interrogation wing felt like a lifetime. Every step was heavy with the weight of what was at stake. They couldn't afford to mess this up. Simmons was seated in the interrogation room, his expression now cold and calculating. He wasn't the broken man he had been on the ground of the warehouse. He was a politician, a man accustomed to using his influence to navigate out of trouble. Maya knew this wouldn't be easy. Good evening, Mr. Simmons, she said as she stepped into the room, her voice calm but firm. I hope you've had time to think about your situation. Simmons looked up at her, a sneer curling on his lips. You think you can break me, Agent Wilson? I've been in this game too long. You don't know who you're dealing with. Maya sat down across from him, her posture relaxed but her mind sharp. You're right, Simmons. I don't know everything about you, but I do know that people like you always slip up. They always leave something behind, and I know enough to make sure you don't get away this time. He didn't respond immediately, but Maya could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. For the first time, he seemed unsure. Maya leaned forward slightly. You're in a corner, Simmons, and you have one choice. Talk to me, help us take down the rest of the syndicate, and maybe you'll get a deal. Or you can stay silent, and we'll make sure you're buried so deep, no one will ever remember your name. Simmons's lips twitched, but he said nothing. Maya knew this wasn't over. Not yet. But tonight, for the first time, Simmons wasn't the one in control. She was. The silence in the interrogation room was oppressive. Simmons sat across from Maya, his hands cuffed to the metal table, his eyes steely and unreadable. He'd already made it clear that he wasn't going to break easily, and Maya knew that the game had only just begun. But there was something about his defiance that made her even more determined. Simmons had spent years playing a game of power, manipulating people and hiding behind layers of influence. It was time to pull those layers away. You're not the first man I've interrogated, Simmons, Maya said, her voice calm but firm, her eyes never leaving his. And you won't be the last. But if you think you can outsmart me, you're wrong. Simmons remained silent, his lips pressed into a thin line. Maya didn't flinch. She wasn't here to coddle him. She was here to break him. She leaned back in her chair, her posture casual, but her mind working at full speed. You know, Simmons, I've seen your type before, men who think they're untouchable. They surround themselves with yes men, with the power to make everything go away. But you and I both know that power only works as long as people don't realize it's a house of cards. You toppled a few pieces today, but there are plenty left standing. She let the words hang in the air, watching for any crack in his facade. She knew that the longer he stayed silent, the more pressure it put on him. People could only take so much before they cracked. Finally, Simmons spoke, his voice low and tight. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Agent Wilson. This isn't some small-town operation. You're going up against people who own this city, this state. People who have the resources to bury anyone who gets in their way." Maya's eyes narrowed. "I've heard that before. The powerful people line. But here's the thing, Simmons. You're sitting in a room with a federal agent, and we've already taken down your operation. You've been exposed. Your allies are scrambling right now, trying to figure out what happened. I don't care how much money or power they have. The moment you got arrested, they lost." Simmons's jaw clenched, but he remained quiet. Maya knew she had him on the ropes. His bravado was fading, but he wasn't ready to give up just yet. She had to keep pressing. "You're not going to get out of this," Maya said, her voice sharp. "Not by hiding behind your contacts or your so-called connections. If you think you'll be protected, you're wrong. You'll end up like everyone else, forgotten, irrelevant. All your wealth, all your influence means nothing if you don't have your freedom." Simmons shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. It was subtle, but Maya noticed. The man who once had the world at his feet was starting to realize that it was slipping away. "Do you really think they'll just leave me here?" Simmons spat, his voice laced with venom. "You think your little investigation means anything to them? The moment I call my lawyers." Maya cut him off. "You've been calling your lawyers for years, haven't you? Using them to cover your tracks, to hide your crimes. But this time, your money won't help you. And those lawyers, they can't protect you from the evidence we've got." She let that sink in, watching him carefully. Simmons was calculating, looking for an escape. But Maya knew the walls were closing in on him, and it was only a matter of time before he'd have nowhere to run. "There's no way out, Simmons," she said again, her tone softer now, but no less forceful. "If you want to save yourself, you need to start talking. You need to tell me who's pulling the strings. Who's behind this operation?" For a moment, Simmons's expression shifted. Maya saw it, a brief flicker of doubt, of fear. But then it was gone, replaced by the mask of arrogance. "I'm not talking," he said defiantly. Maya leaned in, her voice lowering to a near whisper. "You think you're the only one who's been playing this game. You think you're the only one who's been working the system. The people behind this, they are already planning their next move. They're looking for a new face to replace you. They're already moving in to take control." Simmons shifted again, his hand twitching as though he might reach for something, perhaps a pen, perhaps the edge of the table. But Maya knew he wasn't thinking about an escape plan anymore. His mind was racing, processing what she had said. He was starting to crack. Maya didn't let up. "I'm offering you a choice, Simmons. You can keep playing this game, hoping your power will protect you. Or you can tell me what I need to know and give your prosecutors the information they need to bring down the real players. You talk now, and maybe you get a lighter sentence. You stay quiet, and you'll rot in a cell for the rest of your life." Simmons stared at her, his gaze hard and unyielding. But then, just as Maya thought he might hold his ground, something changed. His eyes shifted, his breath shallow, and for the first time since he walked into that room, he looked less certain. Maya leaned forward just a fraction more, never breaking eye contact. She knew she was close. Simmons had one foot out the door, and she was about to slam it shut. "Tell me who your connections are," she pressed. "Tell me who else is involved in this, and you might walk out of here with a deal. You're running out of time." Simmons's lips parted, a breath escaping him, as if he were about to speak. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. Then, with a slow exhale, he finally said the words she had been waiting to hear. Simmons exhaled slowly, his eyes flickering as if weighing the decision. The brief silence in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating. Maya didn't flinch. She kept her posture steady, her mind sharp. She had already heard the fear in his voice. The facade was starting to crack, and now it was time to make him break wide open. "You think you can protect me?" Simmons muttered, his voice losing some of its earlier arrogance. "You think your little promises mean anything in this game?" Maya leaned in slightly, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "I'm not making you promises, Simmons. I'm giving you a lifeline. You want to see daylight again, or do you want to rot in a prison cell for the next 30 years? The room was thick with tension, but Maya kept the pressure on. Simmons had spent his life manipulating others, staying one step ahead of the law. But now, with no one to hide behind, the walls were closing in. The people he had once relied on were abandoning him, and even his wealth couldn't shield him from the truth that was rapidly encircling him. Simmons' hands clenched into fists, but his face remained as cold as ever. I can't. I can't tell you what you want to know. Maya didn't flinch. You can either be part of the solution, Simmons, or you can stay part of the problem. There's no middle ground. No safe way out. His eyes darted around the room, looking anywhere but at her. She could see the battle taking place in his mind, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. The longer he stayed silent, the more certain Maya became that she was close to breaking through. You know, she continued, her voice softening ever so slightly, you've been running this operation for a long time. You've manipulated people, buried evidence, and bribed your way through life. But no one's untouchable forever, and the people you've been protecting, they won't be able to help you now. The law is coming for them, just like it's coming for you. The words seemed to land. For a brief moment, Simmons looked vulnerable. He shifted in his seat, rubbing his temples as if trying to push back the flood of realization. Maya knew she was getting closer. She waited, giving him time to wrestle with his options. Finally, with a deep breath, Simmons spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. There's a man. His name is Morgan, but you won't find him through normal channels. He's been laundering money for years, and he's deep into local politics. He's untouchable, and he's got ties to a senator out in D.C., someone big. I don't know who, but he's the one calling the shots. Morgan runs things now, not me. I was just a middleman. Maya's heart skipped a beat. Morgan. This was the lead they'd been hoping for, the person who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. Simmons wasn't the top dog, Morgan was, and if he had ties to someone in Washington, they were now dealing with an operation far bigger than they'd ever imagined. Where can I find Morgan? Maya asked, her voice low and urgent, leaning closer as if she could make him spill everything with her presence alone. Simmons hesitated, looking like he was about to close up again. Maya could feel the shift in the room, the resistance building. She pressed harder, keeping her tone calm but firm. You want to make sure you're not left holding the bag when this all comes crashing down, don't you? I don't know where he is, Simmons said, his voice faltering. But I know who does. A guy named Rayford. He works for Morgan. He's his fixer, his go-between. Rayford has access to all his private deals, and he's always with him. He can get you close, but only if you know how to find him. You'll need to get to him through the old docks, where we were just last night. That's where the real meetings happen. But you'll never get past security. Morgan's people, they're not your average thugs. Maya took a slow breath, processing the new information. It was a lead, a solid one. Rayford, the docks. She had the pieces now, but the puzzle was far from complete. The fact that Morgan had such tight security meant they were dealing with an organization that was ruthless and willing to do whatever it took to protect their interests. Simmons saw the determination in her eyes, and for a fleeting moment, his expression softened. Be careful, Agent Wilson. This is bigger than you think. And if Morgan gets wind of this, he won't hesitate to take you out. You don't know what kind of people you're dealing with. Maya stood, her mind already working on the next steps. I'm not afraid of Morgan or his people. I'm coming for him, Simmons. And when I do, you'll wish you'd talked sooner. She turned and walked toward the door, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on her. This wasn't just about taking down a small-time syndicate anymore. They were up against a force with enough power to reach the highest levels of government, with connections so deep that no one would be safe once it all came to light. As the door closed behind her, she could feel the enormity of the task ahead. But she was ready. She had to be. There was no turning back now.